What's up, everybody? I am Charlie Marlow. That is Eric Messersmith. This is Everybody Settled Down. Yesterday, we did our special OJ Simpson episode. Today, we're going to get back to what we do with talking all things politics. Eric, how you doing, man?
Doing well, Chuck. We're just over 6 months now, 6.5 months to go.
Okay, so we got some news with the Arizona abortion ruling. And I do think, we can talk about this story, but also big picture. Look, Trump and Biden both have their many negatives, couple positives for each of them. I don't think anybody's really as a whole in love with either of these candidates. But if you look at it from a policy standpoint, you can surely make the case that this election may come down to abortion versus immigration, each side's best issue. And this abortion thing is not going away, and Democrats have had a lot of success running on it for the last couple years. It was huge in 2022. I don't know if it'll be as huge in 2024. What do you think?
I think this week was a big encapsulation of why this issue is going to be such a big deal and why it's going to be really hard for Trump. Because he started the week on Monday with Trump putting out a video statement where he for the kind of spoke about his position on abortion going forward, kind of in some detail for the first time, because he had flirted with supporting a national ban of 15 or 16 weeks. He had openly talked about doing that, but in this video he didn't mention that. What he mentioned was, I'm glad that the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade, which of course he took credit for because he deserves credit or blame, depending on how you view it, because he appointed three of the justices in the majority that made that decision. But what he talked about was, I want it to be up to the states, which is where it is now. Let the states decide, let the states work their will, and that is going to be what we live with. That he came out with a position. The next day, the Arizona Supreme Court announces their decision that an 1864 law, before Arizona was a state, this is during the Civil War, this is way before women had the right to vote, that outlawed basically all abortion, with the only exception being to save the life of the mother, was going to go into effect in 14 days. And so immediately Trump's position of, well, leave it up to the states, and then Arizona's Supreme Court says this is going to be what Arizona is going to have to live with. That's going to be the decision of this state, at least for now. It showed you why that's such a tough position for Trump. And so finally, later in the week, he was pressed, would you sign a national abortion ban, which is something he didn't talk about in his video. And for the first time, he said no. That now, this is Trump, so we know his positions are fluid, but that's the first time he has ever taken a firm stance that he would not sign a national abortion ban. Now, in a way, that's kind of a moot point, because I don't think you're ever going to have 60 votes in the Senate to pass a national abortion ban anyway, setting it at 15 or 16 weeks. But it is interesting that he took that position. And I think that's smart politically for him. And I think we all know Trump's positions on a lot of these issues are fungible, right? And so he realizes, because he's got pretty good political radar, that this is a loser for him, and that I think the best thing he can do politically is where he is now at the end of this week, which is to come out and say, look, I want the states to decide. My personal opinion is Arizona went too far with their Supreme Court. They'll work that out, but I do not support any kind of federal legislation. I think that's probably the best he's going to be able to do. And in terms of the political impact, the other thing the Arizona Supreme Court said was that a ballot initiative, and we talked about this a little bit last week, can go forward for November on abortion. And in every state so far, since Roe was overturned, where a ballot initiative has come up dealing with abortion, the pro-choice side has won every time. That includes some conservative states as well as liberal states. And so in Florida, they're projected to have a ballot initiative this year. Florida's probably not going to be close enough at the presidential level for it to matter, but Arizona is going to be very close. And so if you have a big turnout of people who are mad as hell because there's an 1864 abortion law that is now in effect in Arizona, and they have a chance to come out and vote for a constitutional amendment that would be pro-choice, which I assume will pass with a pretty big margin. That is really good news for Joe Biden.
Right. And this is one to me where I just feel like the extremes of this are so obvious and so wrong to so many people. And I understand, people have their own religious thoughts. But when we're talking about no exceptions for rape, incest, life of the mother, I'm here in Missouri. You see what's going on in Texas. I mean, when you talk about extremes, that's about as extreme as you can get. Now, I understand the other side, even though I don't agree with it, in terms of, well, this is a potentially a human being and all life is important, even if the life starts at trauma, which would be something like I'm discussing, like rape or whatever it is. But I actually believe that the majority of the country, and the majority of the country didn't want Roe overturned, by the way. I think it's important to note that. But some type of compromise, I'm looking right now. I remember when this story happened, a lot of people were bringing up the abortion laws in France. And I'm reading here, abortion in France is legal upon request until 14 weeks after conception, 16 weeks after the pregnant woman's last menstrual period. Whatever the number of weeks that potentially you could compromise on, like I think what's going on in Florida, you saw that as a thing with DeSantis, like 6 to me seems like it's not enough. A lot of women don't even know in some cases that they're pregnant. So whatever the weeks, if there could ever be a compromise on this, to me what France has, 14, 16 weeks, that seems like a pretty fair compromise that a lot of people in the United States would agree on. Of course, there's going to be some people who never agree, but I'm talking about a huge swath of the middle, I think would accept something like that.
Yeah, well, I think Republicans have tried post Roe to position themselves that way. I mean, when you listen to Lindsey Graham, who's proposed a 15-week ban, he makes the exact argument you make. He says, "Look, France, and I think he said 47 out of 50 European countries have a ban, have abortion legal up to somewhere between 12 and 16, 14 and 16 weeks in that range, right?" But and so Trump thought, I think, well, this will be my position too. The problem with that position is that it would only apply to states like California and Illinois. It wouldn't apply to Mississippi and Alabama, right? It would allow the states who have 6-week bans, or in the case of now, what's going to be the law in the land of Arizona, which is almost a complete ban, they would be able to keep their bans, but blue states would now have to be at 15 weeks, right? So it's not a true compromise. You're right. A true compromise would be saying, okay, we'll pass a national abortion mandate, but it will apply to every state equally. So California and Alabama and Georgia and Utah and Nevada will all have the same. Because if you want to compare what they do in Europe to the United States, that would be the apples to apples comparison. Because in France, it's not 14 weeks in Paris and then 6 weeks in rural areas. It is a complete national standard. So that would be the real compromise. I don't think we'll ever get there as a country. I don't think either side would ever allow that to happen. But if you were saying what would be the compromise, that would be it. A national abortion policy where you had, say, 15 weeks all across the country. I don't think that will ever happen. In fact, I don't ever think any kind of national abortion legislation will ever happen, because unless the filibuster is done away with in the Senate, which, who knows if that happens in the future. But as long as there's a filibuster in the Senate and you need 60 votes, you're never passing any kind of controversial abortion legislation one way or the other. So what's going to happen is the pro-life side won this. They won what they thought was a major battle in overturning Roe versus Wade, and it was. But A, it's been a political loser for them, and I think it's going to continue to be. And B, we're going to end up in a place where abortion is going to still be mostly legal across the country. And what I mean by that is, yes, we're going through a period now where you have all these, strange decisions like the Arizona Supreme Court. But eventually what's going to happen is in blue states and even purple states like Arizona, and even red states like Florida, ballot initiatives are going to pass where they're able to do ballot initiatives, and it's going to enshrine abortion rights in the Constitution for those states. And so what you're going to end up with in a few years is abortion will be roughly legal in most of the country, and it will be and the total number of abortions probably won't drop because people will be able to get access either in the state they live in or in a neighboring state to abortion. In fact, data that has come out so far has shown, at least in the first year of Roe being overturned, the total number of abortions in the US didn't drop. What changed is where those abortions were happening. So that's why the Roe versus Wade decision, as big of a deal as it was, and I don't want to downplay it, it was a huge deal and a huge win for the conservative side. But at the end of the day, it's a political loser. It will continue to be. And I don't think it will end up in fewer abortions. So I don't think you will have made any practical gain in what your objective was.
Right. And I think you just I think you just described that perfectly. Where's the win? If you're really trying to, because of your belief system, your morals, your religion, whatever, if your goal is to actually reduce the number of abortions and you're not doing that and you're losing everywhere else politically because of that, you hate to say where's the win and loss in this situation, because again, it's about a life, but where's the win there? The true win for the GOP, it's not there. And I'll make, this might be a terrible analogy, but again, I'm sitting in here in Missouri. And I'm not trying to compare the two issues. Very different, very different. But I always laugh when Missouri doesn't have legal sports gambling. So what do people do? First of all, either get on their offshore app, but what a lot of people do in St. Louis, I live in St. Louis, you know this, used to live here, Eric, right across the river is Illinois. What people literally do is they drive their car into a parking lot over the bridge to legally post their bets in Illinois. So again, might be a terrible analogy, but like, you're not stopping people from gambling. You're stopping people from legally gambling in your state. They're just going with an offshore book now from Aruba, or they're going across the river, the Mississippi to Illinois, and you're losing all that tax revenue. So the same with Missouri with abortions. Are you really preventing abortions? Like you said, probably not. All they're doing now is driving to a different state. So again,
Right.
where is the real win?
Right. And again, we'll see what the numbers come out. You may, on the margins, decrease the total number of abortions for a couple of years until this all gets sorted out and it's legal in most states, which again, I think is where we will end up once these ballot initiatives are able to pass in a lot of these states. And so at the end of the day, what have you done practically? You've inconvenienced a lot of women who are going to have to go do this, and in some cases you may have forced some women to have children they didn't want to have because they didn't have the means or the capability to cross state lines. So you've accomplished maybe a slight reduction in the total number of abortions, and the price you've paid for that politically is election loss after election loss, and maybe losing the presidency. It's one of the big reasons they didn't take the Senate in 2022 and barely won the House in 2022 is because of this issue. And I look, in some ways, I respect it because if you are on that pro life side and you believe that all abortion is murder and you believe life starts at conception, and you say, you know what, that is what I believe, and I am willing to pay the political price for that because I think it's the right thing. I don't necessarily agree with that position, but I respect that position. But you should at least acknowledge that that is what you're doing. Your purity of trying to force this issue when clearly the American public writ large is not with you is resulting in election losses and at the end of the day, very little, if any, decrease in abortion, which was your ultimate goal.
Okay, let's move on to inflation. And you got the new CPI, you got the new inflation numbers, and I think it's fair to say now. Some people will tell you that it's the exact same. I disagree with those people. To me, clearly gas was much more expensive a couple years ago. Your grocery prices were much more expensive a couple years ago. However, clearly the prices have not returned to pre-COVID or pre whatever you want to call it, 2021, whatever, whenever it started, those levels. So things still cost a lot of money. I was just talking with somebody. I was in Ohio the other day, and they were basically saying, I didn't feel like I really had to live paycheck to paycheck before this hit me the last couple of years, which I think is obviously very fair, and people are living this each and every day. There's also, like, you have food and gas, but there's some other hidden costs. I mean, insurance has skyrocketed, and
Yes.
what it takes to fix your car. And I have a small rental property business, and I'm kind of dealing with this myself over the last couple of years, in terms of you don't want to raise rent on folks. My goal was always to never raise anybody's rent until they moved out. The goal was, okay, once they move out, then I'll raise rent for the next tenant. Problem is, if you don't raise rent to keep up with costs, folks know that, and they'll never move out because your spot is now such a better deal than where they're getting somewhere else. And what I'm trying to say is, like, I went through the increase in insurance and HOA if you have a condo, and taxes. I mean, it was almost like I would have had to raise the rent 150 to 200, let's just say 150 to $200 per unit to make the same amount as I was making before. Like, that's pretty drastic. So if people are wondering why your rent's going up, I know landlords are the terrible slumlords, they're all awful
That's
people. That's not really true, but I'm telling you, like, the costs increase. And then, not even talking about like contracting work, handymen, whatever it is to fix things.
yeah.
Like, everything has gone up so much, it's almost impossible to not raise rents over the last couple years since COVID.
Well, Charlie, greedy landlords all over the country appreciate your defense, and I think
Yes.
that it's good that you gave them that strong defense. No, I'm kidding. But so where I live in Santa Monica, we have rent control, and that's exactly what happens. People don't leave for the most part because the market rates, especially post COVID, are so much higher than most people, are paying. But you're right. Look, inflation is a killer. It's a political killer because the prices are roughly 20% higher across the board than they were when Biden took office. Now, you and I have spent a lot of time talking about the backstory of that and some of the putting it in perspective and the nuances of it, and those are important. But what really mattered at this point is the general trend, and the trend had been really good for Biden. Yes, the prices were high. That's already baked in. People, they're not going back down. That's not happening. So the best you could have hoped for with your Biden was a big decrease in the rate of inflation, and that was happening. And look, prices are still down. If you look at CPI, it peaked at 9% in mid 2022. This latest reading was 3.5. So in that regard, it's a dramatic decrease in a fairly short period of time. However, that is still above the 2% the Fed wants, and it's kind of going sideways now. We had a big drop, and now we're around 3%, and we're kind of stuck in that area. Now we'll see as the year goes on, but one of the big reasons that matters as well is because of what you were talking about, which is housing. And it's not just renting, it's buying. And buying is so hard in a large chunk of the country now. And one of the big reasons is the interest rates. And that is the added on element of inflation is in order to decrease inflation as much as we did, the Fed needed to raise interest rates to help do that. And that makes the price to borrow money go up. And most especially when you're trying to buy housing, which is already pretty expensive in most of the big metro areas around the country. So now these interest rates are that used to be not that long ago. People can remember 3% interest rates, 4% interest rates. Now you're at like 7. And the Fed, people were thinking would be able to cut rates because inflation finally seemed like it was coming down. And now that it's kind of going sideways, the market, and you saw the stock market take a big drop yesterday. And the reason for that was because these sideways numbers are convincing investors and convincing people that the Fed is not going to be able to cut rates in the summer. And it's going to be most likely in the fall or maybe the winter, second half of the year, which means Interest rates on homes, cars, loans, credit cards is going to stay really high. That's really bad news for Biden because the feeling people have, the double whammy of expenses of, like you said, going to the grocery store, living paycheck to paycheck, and also thinking if I live in a large chunk of the country, I can't buy a home right now because these interest rates are so high. That double whammy, I think, is really hurting Biden. And it doesn't look like it's going to get better anytime soon on the interest rate side.
Yeah, and I just want to make clear. So obviously, like everybody's paying more, and I feel for everyone who's now living paycheck to paycheck, or it's very hard to make ends meet. You and I, we usually talk about these things too in the kind of the specter of politics, and I get it. Like a lot of people are just going to blame or credit the president for kind of whatever is going on in their life that day. And I try to always look beyond that. And I get it. We talked about this a couple weeks ago that basically there was 10 years of stagflation in the 70s and no president survived it. No president survived it. Everybody basically, you know, did not get reelected. I understand that. I don't think it's necessarily fair in terms of to blame the president for that in the 70s. In the same way, I just find it funny. It's you know, things were very good economically under Trump. Then COVID hit. And I just feel like there's so many people out there that are trying to act like the disruption was the election. It was not the election in
Right.
2020 when Biden took over early 2021. It
It
was
was COVID.
clearly COVID. It was COVID, and we printed all the money the first couple of years, and then all the inflation came the next couple of years, and you had shutdowns all over the world, and you had supply chain disruptions. And I understand it's not a great argument. It's nuanced. It's easier to point to the president. So I get why people are blaming Joe Biden, and he's part of it. Clearly, he runs the federal government. But if you're not acknowledging that it started in 2020 under Trump and it continued in 2021 under Biden, I mean, I don't think we're being fair there. If we're not acknowledging what actually caused the inflation, that's why when I see all these people, I get it because you're running a campaign. But when I see these people who are very smart economically and they're trying to just blame Biden for inflation,
Right.
I'm like, are you really? It's insulting to your audience, is what you're doing because
Yes.
I can basically say anything to them and they're not gonna check on it.
Right. To me, the thing that is the most dishonest is when you compare and cherry pick stats in 2020 and 2021 and don't mention the factors going on. Like when people point to gas from 2020 or 2021 and compare it to now. And I'm just thinking, and don't mention, oh, yeah, nobody was driving because everything was shut down and people were working from home. And we all know gas is based on global supply and demand, is the primary factor in gas price. So, not just in America, but around the world, people were locked in their homes. Nobody was driving, nobody was going anywhere. So, to compare gas prices from the heart of the pandemic or even early 2021 to now and not give that context. And I see people do that, and I'm just like, come on, come on. So again, I to be fair, the fairest way to do it is to say, of course, I don't blame Donald Trump for the fact that in March of 2020 we lost 15 million jobs and the unemployment rate spiked to 12%. Of course, I don't blame Trump for that. And of course, I give Biden some credit for the massive amount of jobs he's created, but I also acknowledge that part of that was people returning to work as things open. That is the fair way to assess the job picture. The fair way to assess the inflation picture is to say, I don't give Donald Trump credit for gas prices being $1 a gallon or whatever they were, $1.50, because nobody was driving anywhere because the world was shut down. But I also don't give a ton of blame to Joe Biden for inflation that the world experienced as supply chains were completely disrupted and as we opened our economy again after doing a couple of massive stimuluses that Trump and Biden both did. So that's kind of that's just being fair. But I think with Biden, if you look at the numbers of economic surveys, of you when you ask people how do you feel, the numbers are getting better. And particularly when you ask people, how are you doing? When you ask people that question, it's so striking in the data. It Biden does pretty people feel pretty good about the economy because yes, the inflation has been bad, interest rates have been bad. We talked about that, but the job market is on fire. Unemployment under 4% for the longest stretch since the 1960s. As I said, millions and millions of jobs created, economy growing at a pretty healthy clip around 3%. So people say they're doing pretty well and their neighbors are doing pretty well, but they say the overall economy is bad. And that is kind of the disconnect that Biden, I think, is, going to have to try to work through. And he's going to have to sell it and make the case over these, next 6 months. And we'll see. The data on the inflation is going to be huge because if the prices start to rise again, people will feel that. And you can't explain your way out of that, if you're Joe Biden. You just can't. And that is going to be a real killer for him. So I think how inflation trends over the next few months is going to be really critical, for this election.
Okay, this gets into the topic that we're trying to get to the last several episodes. And we're finally going to get to it, which is people to me are so much more negative and pessimistic right now. And I get some of it, don't get me wrong. I think a lot of it has to do with politics. I think a lot of it has to do with social media. And I think just the real partisanship of politics these days. And I saw this in 2016 when I was watching CNN back then. When Trump first took over, CNN basically had to act like the world was ending. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, if you didn't vote for him, but like we're pretty good, like things are fine. And don't get me wrong, I know after COVID inflation, we're not in normal times here. But to me, we are getting back to normal times. And I still feel like there's way too many people are trying to act like it's just everything is terrible and it's the end of the world. And look, I'm 41 going on 42, and I feel like I have enough life experience. I mean, I went through the 2008 financial crisis. I was laid off from my job in Michigan in 2008. I got a new job here in St. Louis. Then immediately we were furloughed that year. I was wondering if I was going to have a job. So if you're talking about economics, I mean, obviously COVID, the world was shut down. Economically, people are losing their jobs, their businesses are closed. There's an eviction moratorium, getting back to what I was doing at the time, which was that was scary if you're in the rental property business. And look, this is why I kind of joke like most people are small time landlords that have a house or two for some extra money and it's not paid off. So when you all of a sudden say your tenants don't have to pay you your rent, that's pretty scary. That was very scary to me in 2020. We got through all of it. But then if you look, foreign policy, okay, we know what's going on in Ukraine, Russia, what's going on in Israel. But you and I, Eric, I mean, the last 20 years, I mean, Afghanistan, Iraq. I just feel like there's this thought that everything is so terrible and the world is on fire and it's the worst it's ever been. And I'm thinking to myself, I don't feel that way. And I don't think it's just because I do try to avoid as much as I can social media, and I try not to watch partisan news. I try to put things in perspective. But I do think it's the political divide. Right now, if you're on the right, you have to act like the world is ending. And the left did that under Trump. Don't get me wrong. But I think that's kind of also poisoning our brains. Like, Bill Maher said this a couple weeks back, he got crushed for it. He's like, why is everybody so negative? And everybody's like, okay, liberal coastal elitist millionaire who doesn't know what the cost of milk, right? I get that too, but I think there was a lot of truth in what he said. Like, can we have some perspective?
Right.
Can we have some context? I mean, we were just in COVID 2 years ago, 3 years ago. Now it's worse. Like, really? Now it's
Right.
worse?
Yeah, I think there's three reasons for it. What human nature, the business model of media, and social media. I think those are the three reasons. So some of it is just regular human nature. And we see this in our own lives. Think about your own life and think about things that when you were younger, you would have thought were amazing. And now, if you are lucky enough to have them, you just get used to them. You know, you have a nice house and you want a bigger house. You drive a decent car and you want a nicer car. That is just human nature. I mean, could you imagine if you, like my grandmother who passed away in 2016, she was born in the 1920s. She'd have been 100. So she's probably would have been about 100 years old, right? So in the lifetime, could you imagine if you would have went back to when she was young or her talked to her parents and been like, in your daughter's lifetime, you will be able to take a flight from New York City to LA and have lunch in LA. Like you'll be able to wake up in New York City and have lunch in LA. And like that will be relatively affordable to a middle class or upper middle class person. You will be able to, do the things that we take for granted. You will walk around with a computer in your hand that can not only instantly access you through video to, people all over the world, but has like the whole sum of human knowledge at your fingertips. I mean, think about, people would have been like, are you fucking crazy? Like, what are you talking about? And we just accept that as the way of the world. So I think part of it is human nature. We very quickly acclimate to what we have and we just take it for granted. And I think then you add on to that the business model of the media, which has always been negative. If you worked in local TV news for a long time, if it bleeds, it leads. That is not a new saying. That has been around for a very long time. Negative news just plays better than positive news. It just does. We're more interested in it. And maybe there's probably deep-seated psychological reasons for that, but whatever the reasons are, media has figured out the business model and they know what it is and they feed it to you. And again, we're already predetermined to think things could be better. Then you throw in social media and its algorithms onto that fire. Because it's one thing for TV news to do it, but TV news you can tune in and out of. Cable news you can tune in and out of. The internet works on an algorithm. And if you get on YouTube or you get on X or TikTok, you're going to see that negativity. And if you start down that road, you're going to think that we live in the worst time that has ever existed. When in fact, you could argue, and I think you'd be right to say that and I want to be clear, I'm not saying being in like Ukraine or Gaza. I'm saying being in America in 2024, unless you are dirt poor, you're better off than 99% of human beings that have ever lived and much better off than them. I mean, think about just the perspective here. Trying to just be as nonpartisan as possible. Just like over time, I just thought of three things off the top of my head, and I went and looked to make sure I was right on them. Three areas since they've gotten better just in our lifetime, since the 1980s. Violent crime. Look at a graph of violent crime from the 80s to today. And violent crime is down dramatically from its peak in the 1980s. We did have a little bit of a spike during COVID, but even with that, last year in 2023, the FBI reported that murder was down 13%. That was the largest year over year decrease since we started recording statistics. That didn't get a ton of play, but and again, I'm not political. Take it out larger for a 40-year time frame. When you've had Republican and Democrat Congresses and presidents, violent crime's gone like this. Cancer deaths, the death rate from cancer has fallen so much that they estimate 4 million fewer people have died since 1991. So in 35 years than would have died if cancer rates were as high as they were in the early 90s. That's how far cancer death rates have fallen. Obviously, we still have too many people dying from cancer, still work to do, but that is a dramatic increase that has literally saved millions of lives. How about another one? Teen pregnancy. Teen pregnancy, since it peaked in 1991, is down 75%. 75% in 30 years. That is an amazing decrease in teen pregnancy. So those are just three kind of areas that I thought off the top of my head, and I just checked the data to confirm that, where we have made in a relatively short period of time tremendous progress. And these are things you don't hear a ton about on the news. They're reported every once in a while, but we're not banging the drum of, man, look how much better we have done in these three, I would say, relatively important areas of life.
Yeah, and the teen pregnancy one surprised me. I kind of knew that violent crime had peaked in late '80s, '91. I didn't know about the cancer numbers, but the teen pregnancy one surprised me here. And we talk politics on this show, but I think another big part of it. You talked about social media and the algorithms, but it's the old saying that comparison is the theft of joy. And if you're even taking politics out of it, I think to me, we live in this just thing culture of consumerism where it's about clout on social media, unfortunately, with so many of these youngsters and shoes and clothes and cars and whatnot. And I just think like growing up, we didn't have social media. So, okay, you knew the kid in school that maybe had the nicest house, that had the nicest car, whatever it is. But now on social media, like everybody always gives you the best version of their life. I've always tried to not done the showy things on social media. Whether it's a vacation, you get a house, you get a car, whatever it is. I've always been the person I've tried not to put that out there because I think so much of it is about just bragging about your life. But man, like I can see how if you're already kind of just like a depressed person, and then you look at Facebook or Instagram, and all you see is the best version of not just people at your school anymore, not just your neighborhood, but everybody on earth. You're now
Yeah.
comparing yourself to everybody on earth. It's like, what is going to be good enough? You mentioned earlier about you got the house, you want a bigger house. I think there's way too much of that. Sometimes, hey, enjoy the house you have, enjoy the family you have, enjoy the car you have. Don't always be looking for the next bigger house, bigger car, whatever it is. I think that's also a huge part of like we've become more vapid as a society, especially in
Yes.
America, since social media.
Yes.
Facebook has made it terrible. Instagram has made it terrible. Just everything, and the way women and people show each other, show their bodies on. That's a different topic. But like everything we're doing on social media, I think a lot of it is really, really for the worse. And it plays into what we're talking about. Just nobody can enjoy themselves. Like even, I'm a girl, I'm hot. Oh, there's the girl on Instagram. She's way hotter than I am, right? Like, oh, she's getting all the likes. I'm the cute girl at school, but there's this woman in Hollywood with fake everything. She's got 2 million subscribers. She's bouncing her boobs and ass everywhere, right? Like people are
I
comparing
want to be
everything
clear.
to.
You enjoy watching these videos. You're just making a broader point. I get what you're saying.
Listen, I'm not gonna act like I've never seen these videos, but again, think about it from a young girl's perspective. A
Right.
young girl in high school is like, "How can I compete with this?" All the boys you go to Instagram, and probably all the boys on Instagram are following this woman and liking all her booty videos, right?
Yeah, I think first of all, I love the comparison as the thief of joy quote. That's one of my all-time favorite quotes. I think it's great. And I think it really does put it in perspective. I also want to be clear, I'm guilty of a lot of the things that I talk about, like the human nature part of it, of wanting, more. And I'm certainly guilty of the putting nice things on social media because like I look at my own life on social media and I'm like, this because of course I post things that I think, people will like, but you're not going to post the really tough moments necessarily or the things that are, not going to be the most flattering. And those, of course, that's how life is. And if everybody does that, you're right, it leads to a social consciousness of this is how life should be. And of course, that's ridiculous. And it plays on our human nature and also romanticizing the past. I talked about housing earlier. And yes, it is very, trust me, I understand. As someone who rents and would love to own a home, I'm in the boat living in the LA area of it is crazy expensive to try to buy a home here. So I totally sympathize with that. But one thing you have to keep in mind when we bring up the comparison of, well, in the 19, let's say 50s, after the war, you had everybody owning a home on one salary often because many women didn't work. And you had families of 3 or 4 children, and a home could be bought. And that is true. That is true. But look at those homes. They were tiny. Those homes, by the average home size back then was like 1,500 square feet. And you had, instead of families with one kid like you see today, or two at the most, they had three, four, five kids sharing that space. So, yes, it is true. They were able to afford homes at a much younger age and with a much lower income than we can now. But they also were satisfied with those smaller homes and cramming big families into them. We are no longer satisfied with that for the most part. We want bigger homes, nicer homes. 2,000 square feet, that's, I mean, nowadays people would be like, I can't cram myself into there. They want 4, 5, 6,000 square feet. They want the third bathroom. They want the fifth bedroom for their guest. And that's just, and so if you can't get those things, you're like, oh man, in the 1950s, they had these houses. Well, yeah, you wouldn't want to live in that house they had in the 1950s. You'd be miserable. So and that's a generation or two. Our expectations just keep getting more and more and more. And that feeds into the cycle of everything is terrible. When really, if you step back and have any kind of perspective, it is not. It just is not. And again, we always have to preface this with saying there are real problems absolutely in America today. There are people suffering. There are homeless people. There are people really struggling. What we're talking about though is human beings overall, particularly in America in 2024. And if you have some perspective, I think you see it's not as bad as the media would lead you to believe.
Yeah, and by the way, I'm guilty of this too. Don't get me wrong. We were laughing about this on the radio the other day because so my daughter takes taekwondo, and over the last couple years they'll do these sparring exercises. And my daughter's pretty good. So they might spar 2, 3, 4 times. Well, she might win 2, lose 1, or maybe she has a great day, she wins them all, but early on she was having days where she was losing most of them. And it's funny because if you're filming it, what's the one you put on Facebook? You don't put the
Right.
loss. You don't put her getting freaking dominated. Yet she might have went 1-3 in sparring.
Right.
3 losses, 1 win. You put the 1 win on Facebook. And I always laugh like and I would do the same. So we're joking here. But like your kid plays baseball. Your kid goes 1 for 4, he might have a single and 3 strikeouts. Well, you're posting the single. You're deleting the strikeouts for sure.
Right. So now people see your kid, they probably think she's like this Taekwondo black belt,
Right.
because that's what happens when you have, I think social media, so social media factors into this discussion in a large way, but obviously there's a much bigger issue of social media. I think we will look back on social media in the future and we will put it in the same category as alcohol and marijuana, and we will say like gambling. It will be one of those things where it will be legal and people will enjoy it and there will be positives to be gained from it, but we will limit in some way the access of children to it in some way. Maybe not exactly like we do with alcohol. I'm not saying the age limit will be 21, but I'm saying we will draw a distinction between how adults consume it and how children consume it, just like we do for those other things. I think that's eventually where we will land with social media because studies are starting to show, and I think anecdotally, you're right, especially as you pointed out with younger girls, that it is harmful to them. It is harmful to them in some of the same ways that these other things are harmful. And, when we find data backs up that things are harmful to children, we restrict children's access to them, I think, as we should. And I think that's eventually where we will land on social media in the future.
All right, great episode, sir. We went a little shorter on this one because we had our special OJ Simpson legacy episode yesterday. So, Eric, good stuff as always, sir. Everybody watching, please comment, like, subscribe. Hey, the last 2 weeks of the show have been very good, and people like the long shows and the clips and even some shorts. So we're starting to grow here. Please, share us on your social media or put it in a group chat, whatever it is. Jump in the comments, like, subscribe, like I said. Eric, always fun, sir. We'll see you later, man.